And let's play the Sicilian. Let's play the Sicilian. Alert me. Now it's f4. So f4 is a line. And the way to respond correctly to the move f4 is to open up the center immediately with the move d5. And the rationale behind that is we already know that f4 is quite a weakening move. Now, how should we respond to the move e5? And I'll disable the alerts just for now. How should we respond to e5? What is the drawback of this move? What square does it allow one of our pieces now to access? So knight c6, of course, is normal, but I want a specific square that now is accessible to one of our pieces. Right, that's the f5 square. So we will go knight c6, but on the next move, well, actually, and this is why flexibility is more. Bishop g4 would also be good, but let's get our bishop to f5, because that's kind of what I promised. Nice little, hole in the wall, Italian cuisine, good spot. I don't know why I said that, but f5 is a good square. Okay, this guy just disconnected. This move was so powerful. Okay, he reconnected. Now, he wants to go d4 and link up his central pawns. Can we prevent that? Can we prevent the move d4 in some way? Yeah, we can play d4 ourselves. And guess what? Because he's played f4 rather than developed a piece, we can afford to take this kind of liberty. A lot of people were asking me, how do you know when to violate opening principles and when to push a lot of pawns? Well, the thing is, he's violating principles, so we can afford to take some liberties. Now, let's develop our pieces. Let's go e6 to potentially open up the square for the bishop. Now, we have an interesting situation. We have an interesting situation where if we develop the bishop to e7, the knight will have nowhere to go. If we develop the knight to e7, the bishop will have nowhere to go. How do we solve that problem? We solve that problem by moving one of these pieces twice. Does anybody want to offer, any Sherlock Holmes types in the chat want to offer a solution to this problem that we have? Bro Tishka, thank you for the tier 1. Where should we keep? Well, Fianchetto, I will explain why it's bad. Fianchetto is actually bad because the bishop will basically be biting on granite on g7. Exactly. Knight d7, knight d5, or knight to g6. Both moves are good. Knight d5 is better because it's centralized, and if he goes c4, that knight can stick itself on e3, forcing him to give up a very important bishop, and in turn, that's going to open up another outpost, the d4 outpost for our knight. That's if he plays c4. So Zen0, 314, another prime sub. Thank you. Now we're going to develop our bishop. Yep, let's go to e3. Takes. And now this knight... Okay, can we go knight d4? Does knight d4 blunder the pawn on e3? And for the record, even sacrificing this pawn would be worth it given the squares that we get. But can we go knight d4? Nope, why not? Because we have knight c2. And that's why it's bad to have an undeveloped queenside. Because this kind of stuff happens when you don't develop one side of the board and you weaken a lot of squares. Okay, he goes knight c3 instead. He tries to keep the tension. What should we do here? How should we resolve this entire situation? Now, first of all, a non-stupid idea would be to just develop our pieces. And I mentioned this, right? Keeping the tension. Because he still cannot take on e3 due to knight c2. But we can also make a far more concrete approach to the position by winning material. How can we do that? How can we win material here with black? Identifying his weakness on d3. Bishop takes d3 is impossible, but what can we do first? We can, of course, we can simply take the bishop. And it's going to be very important to take with a queen. If we take with a bishop here, he can take e3, and then you can quickly put a rook onto it. So this not only wins a pawn, but this kills the coordination of his pieces. Thank you for the knight, which he just blundered. And the queen is perfectly safe because we put a bishop on f5. Okay, now how do we proceed here? Well, there's several ways we can play. What's the simplest move? Do we actually need to really do anything here? The answer is obviously no. That's a rhetorical question. So what would be the most zen move ever? We could check on f2, but what would be the most zen move ever? Bishop e7, yeah. I just want to show you guys that this kind of in-your-face play, just develop your pieces. No need for anything fancy. Just develop. He's not threatening anything. We have the... that's right. Castle. And kind of I allowed this, but that's not scary at all. We can just defend the bishop. Now, well, we have a choice. We can give a check. And let's actually do that, because the queen always has an evacuation route via c2. And it's going to be very important here. Remember what I always say when you're up a lot of material? Do not cling to individual pawns. I know a lot of you want to play e2, but e2 is actually a dangerous move because he can potentially try to win this pawn and the queen could get trapped on f2. So instead, as Rezeev, very good, I'm just going to go rook fd8. I'm going to say, all right, take my pawn, be my guest, but once he takes the pawn, we're just going to double on the d file, and we're basically just going to crush him down that file. We don't need this pawn anymore. It's served its purpose. It's outlived its time. Now, should we trade queens here? We can. We can also play queen takes b2. Let's trade queens in the interest of simplicity, because we already have our rooks poised to get onto the d file. Let's stop him from going g4. You can see that I'm stopping and time to infiltrate with rook d3. And now there's many ways of winning this position. By the way, it's a good idea to fix his kingside pawns so he never can play g4 due to an en passant. And now we can win the game, again, in several different ways. Let's see what he does. Well, he disconnected. He seems to be having internet problems. Yeah, rook c3, c2 is an idea that I had in mind. We can try to relocate one of the rooks to the second rank, and we can try to put the other rook on d3. And then a lot of tactics will emerge. Okay, he disconnects, but he's already completely lost. Yeah, so after g4, we would take on f3. But like I'm talking about in the future, if this rook ever moves away, we would also stop him from going g4. So a very simple game. We can go over it quickly. So by the way, if they take on d5 here, a good idea is to go knight to f6, trying to take the pawn on your own terms. And this is actually a gambit, because how can white defend the d5 pawn? Yeah, I'll answer all questions in sequence, so we will go over the game. If you have a question about the endgame, please wait until we are at that stage of the analysis to ask the question to keep the flow. Now, for extra credit, what should black do here? What should black do here? And after this correct move is stated, yes, e6. Can somebody explain to me why it is that black has not only full compensation for the pawn, but black is probably actually better in this position? Why is that? There's three reasons, three very specific reasons that can be identified here. Number one is development. We have a lot more development. Number two, that development is the sort of obvious pawn structure, but I want you guys to be more specific. Yes, number two is the weakness on f4, right? White has pushed his pawn out to f4, which means that if he castles kingside, he will never be completely safe. But what is the third thing? Yeah, so the second thing is that he's created all these weaknesses. Yeah, and Odramali Mao pointing out the correct third factor, which is the d4 square. This is a humongous outpost for the knight. You can imagine that if a knight lands on d4, oh, that's a juicy, juicy central square. Okay? And by the way, when I say that, a couple of you might be thinking, well, wait a second. How are we going to get a knight on d4 when there is a white knight on f3? But the point isn't that we will get the knight on d4 immediately. The point is that this will always be hanging over white like the sword of Damocles. If the knight ever is gone from f3, or if it's eliminated, then the knight on d4 will be basically unassailable. And I can show you guys many examples of games that go like this, where you weaken a square, thinking that, it's fine, I have a piece guarding that square. Eventually that piece is eliminated, and there is hell to pay as a consequence. And to give you guys a very quick, very quick example as a detour. And I like doing this. I think it helps people remember. I had a painful experience like this one time. Exactly like this, where I made this kind of misjudgment, thinking that one of the squares I weakened is perfectly well defended by one of my pieces, but yeah, so there we go. Let me just switch scenes 1 second. I have to switch to the chess-based scene. All right. Yeah, and I'll continue the game after that. Yeah, so this position was from one of my games from 2009 against the Grandmaster. What is the weak square in this position that is in question? And how should white go about occupying that weak square? White to play. And, okay, d5 is, of course, the key weakness. What should white do here? Well, d6 is a weak pawn, but, whoops, no. So what should white do? Should white immediately put a knight on d5? Or should white do something first? So actually, no. Knight d5 is not correct. Bishop g5 is correct. And the reason that knight d5 is not correct is because, if you think about it, what's going to happen in the end is that a rook is going to get to d5. But what piece does white actually want on d5? He probably wants a knight on d5. Here, how can black go about dislodging this rook from d5? That's, by the way, why knights are better outpost occupiers than rooks, because rooks and queens are easy to kick away, like knight b4, exactly. So what my opponent does is go bishop g5, and then he takes the knight, and then he comes back to c3, and knight d5. Now, it is true, I just said that knights are the best outpost occupiers, but this is an exception. Why is this an exception? For the very simple reason, first of all, the rook is unassailable. But guess what he does? Guess what he does? Boom. For extra credit, does anyone want to tell me where this knight is going? Where the hell is this knight eventually going? Where's this knight going? Boom, 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 and like clockwork. Boom, bum. Look at the beauty, beautiful position. All of his pieces come into the game, and he gets an unassailable knight on d5. Many, many moves after that weak square was first created. So that's the power and the danger of creating an outpost like this, because it can define the whole game. Okay, and why is this knight so good? Because it's visually. I mean, look at it. It's dominating over the whole board, and my opponent eventually won. So this was a very good lesson for me to be very careful about how I go about managing my weaknesses. And it's okay to create weaknesses if you have counterbalancing factors. Chess is a game of tit for tat, as I always say. But weak squares in particular in the center of the board that can be occupied with knights, be very careful about that. Okay, back to the speedrun. So that's the reason why this sacrifice is kind of fine from a general perspective. So our opponent played e5, which is fine. Bishop f5, this is normal developing. Now d4 is the key move. We could have gone here, but then we would have allowed him to go d4. Actually, this is a good position for black. This is like a good French. If you know what the French looks like, and comparison is often a good way to evaluate positions. By the way, this is, I think, a point that some people miss. You can often make a lot of sense of a position by comparing it. This is the main line of the French advance. Now, literally, we can take this position and compare it side by side to this position. The bishop has jumped over the pawn on e6, which is a really good thing. French is a solid opening, so this, by definition, like by a transitive property, has to be at least quite a bit better than the French. But still, we decided to prevent him from doing that. And now, of course, we solve the problem of insufficient space by getting the knight to the center. And then we get it to e3, vacating the d4 square for the other knight, which we occupy, win the pawn, take the free knight, develop our pieces, give up the pawn for the greater good, double rooks, infiltrate, stop his kingside threats, and win the game. So very simple, methodical. And the key thing to remember when converting the advantage, do not hesitate to give up a pawn or two for sort of the greater good. Okay. Any questions? Why not bishop takes h3? And if you're indicating a move that I didn't play, try to be specific. Try to be specific about where. Well, fantastic fan. That's a too general of a question for white or for black. And I basically, if you want to look at what I play in the speedrun, like I try to tailor the openings to what I would recommend to that level. Okay, let's go on. Isn't that central knight worth more than his undeveloped bishop that you trade? That's a great question by Second Handska. And yes, in a strict sense, you're right. This knight is better placed than the bishop. But if you think about what happens as a consequence of this trade, we get a square that's, again, worth its weight in gold. So you do make a small positional concession, giving up a better piece in a strict sense, but in return, you get something that is a far greater value than the relative superiority of the knight over the bishop. Yes, so even if queen c1 won a pawn, I would still have probably gone there because, again, we would get this massive potential outpost. Okay, every segment will be on YouTube. Virtually every segment will be on YouTube, guys. It will also be in my Twitch VODs, so worry not. Okay, so let's go for another Sicilian. And I want to keep things moving along, so I'm sorry if I didn't get to people's questions. Now, bishop c4, how do we usually meet this move? As a review from our earlier games, we don't see this move that often anymore. It's more common at like a 1200, 1300 level. Yeah, so we want to go e6 at some point. Let's first develop our knight. But then we want to go e6 to blunt the bishop. And we can go d5. We don't have to, though. We can actually develop with knight f6. This is the best move, actually. And to some people, this might... Okay, now we have a really cool idea. What is this really cool idea? I've mentioned it in other contexts before. Like, it exists in other types of positions. But, yeah, man, you got some people on fire here. Knight takes e4, bingo. Knight takes e4, and then d5. What makes this good is that it eliminates white's control over the center. Okay, he doesn't take, so let's just go d5 anyway. But if he would have taken the knight, we go d5, eliminating his control over the center and taking out his kind of important light-squared bishop. So now we're up a pawn. We can simply continue our development in a sort of conventional fashion. We can first unpin ourselves with bishop d7. Thank you. Glad to hear that, Major. First, should we take the knight? And don't say no just because I ask a question. I know that's like the high school thing to do, and I'm used to that from like my own tests. Yes, we should, because we cripple his pawn structure. Why not? Trades are good. Let's just develop the other bishop again. Is this passive in a strict sense? Kind of. But we're up a pawn. We have a huge center. And so, again, remember, not every one of your pieces has to be conquering the, fringes of the Roman Empire at any moment, okay? Okay, c4 is a very good move. Which pawn should we take? Or should we even take a pawn? Yeah, so what we want to try to do here, how should I put it, is take the sting out of what's going on in the center. We want to be careful about opening up the e-file before we've castled. Thank you, Ahardis Hussein. So we actually want to play knight takes d4, and I'll explain after the game exactly why knight takes d4 is the best capture versus all the other captures. I'll explain it blow by blow. And he also disconnected. Man, we are dealing with some disconnectors today. One of the keys to understanding knight takes d4 is to understand that if takes, we have what move at the end of the line? And it's already been mentioned, but I want a couple of you to point out this move. Wow, looks like he's overwhelmed by this. What is the move? Yeah, bishop f6, right? And you skewer the queen to the rook, winning the rook. Right. And another disconnect. Wow. These are some short games. So, yeah. So basically, e6, knight f6. Now, what about e5 in this position? E5 looks a little bit nasty, but we can immediately target the pawn with knight g4. And we can actually go d6, breaking up this pawn, forcing it to take. And we have a perfectly good position for black. Where should this bishop go? Where should the c8 bishop be developed eventually? Either now or in the future. Yeah, b7, of course. We should fianchetto it. This is a great idea to fianchetto the bishop. You actually have Horowitz bishops. That's what they're called. Because they're both sort of angling at the king. So you should take the clue from the other bishop. Like, their pieces should cooperate. And that's the reason why e5 is not dangerous. d5 is also fine, but the problem is he doesn't have to en passant here. And your knight could get like stuck on h6 potentially. Okay. And by the way, white has to go rook e1 because this would blunder a pawn. So rook e1, knight takes c4. That's the key move. d5 here would be not as effective because after e takes d5, we would not be able to capture with the pawn due to the pin. So if rook takes e4, we go d5, and we pin, and you guys are very much familiar with this idea. What should white do here? And remember that when you're losing a piece, especially if you've blundered or you're in the middle of some sort of tactical operation, you want to give that piece up for the maximum amount of material. So bishop d5, queen d5, knight c3, defending, attacking. But I simply drop my queen back. Black's got the two bishops. Black's got better central control than white. And eventually this bishop from c8 is going to be fianchettoed. And remember, we've eliminated white's light squared bishop. So it's going to be completely uncontested, which is a really good thing when you're fianchettoed to the long diagonal facing the king. Hopefully that makes sense. The position is still equal, but it's a pleasant kind of equal. So he goes d4, we go d5. Now the key moment in the game. There's no science to understanding the pawn square. We just have to consider all of the captures and weigh their pros and cons. D takes c4, I didn't like for a very specific reason. And what I don't like about this is that if this e-pawn disappears from e6, he's going to have a direct line to my king. I don't really like that situation, so he can go d5, which is another pawn sacrifice. But can you guys appreciate that this is a little bit nasty, right? I mean, he's got the pressure. Sure, I can castle, but now he fianchettos the bishop, and now this bishop kind of stares down my g7 pawn. In short, white's pieces here are very active, and I don't like a situation where, even at the cost of two pawns, there's such a disparity in piece activity. So that capture was ruled out. Now this one, he plays c takes d5, and it's exactly the same thing. The e-file has gotten opened. He can actually pile up on it with queen e2, and I'm having a hard time castling. So that was out of the question. Now what about not reacting at all? This would be my second choice. The issue with this is now he takes a bunch of times, and he isolates the pawn on d5, right? Now the pawn on d5 is super weak. If I play bishop c5, then queen takes d5, and he restores material equality. We actually get a similar scenario as in the d takes d4 line. And so for that reason, knight takes d4 is the best. What this actually does is it prevents c takes d5, because now this bishop is going to be hanging, which was not the case previously. And if he tries to remedy the problem of the bishop by first taking, then c takes d5 allows queen takes d5. And once again, queen takes d4 allows bishop f6, skewering the queen to the rook. And instead he disconnected, but already white is in very big trouble. Does that make sense? Hopefully I was at least semi coherent in explaining the various captures. And here's the concluding point I'll make before we move on to the next game, which is that there are certain positions where not every single chess move has verbal logic behind it. Sometimes you just have to frickin' get your hands dirty and look at the moves, okay? There's no inherent reason why knight d4 is the move. It's just that the other moves are bad. And there's a reason that why the other moves are bad. But you just have to calculate, you can't always talk your way into the correct move. You usually, in fact, the higher rated you get, the less you talk to yourself during the game and the more you calculate. So at my level, the logic behind moves is commonplace to everybody. All GMs have a baseline level of knowledge, and you're not going to beat anybody by out-logicking them, if that makes sense, at the GM level. So that's why calculation becomes so incredibly crucial. Although it's crucial at all levels, it's particularly indispensable at the grandmaster level, because a marginal superiority over someone else in terms of your visualization, your ability to calculate, can result in exponential improvements in your games, because that's such a high stakes area of the game. Okay, so let me put it this way. At the GM level, everybody knows how to make layups. So you're sort of practicing your three-pointer. And at other levels, and I don't mean this in a condescending way, if you shoot layups or free throws really, really well, you can get a huge edge over somebody. But at a certain point, everybody's a 90% free throw shooter. So that's why other things become important.